Welcome back to the channel. In the wake of Count Drogo's assassination and the murder of Prince Guaimar IV, the political landscape of southern Italy was thrown into chaos. With the old power brokers gone, the balance of the region shifted dramatically. The Normans, once hired swords and foreign guests, had become dominant players, reshaping alliances and threatening the very order that had held for decades. But their meteoric rise didn't go unnoticed. In this episode, we dive into the Battle of Civitate, fought in the summer of AD 1053, a clash between the rising Norman warlords and a determined Pope Leo IX, who sought to put an end to their growing power. We'll explore the makeup of both the Papal and Norman armies, the strategic routes each force took across the rugged terrain of southern Italy, and break down the brutal confrontation that followed. And finally, we'll examine the dramatic aftermath, how one battle forever altered the relationship between the papacy, the Normans, and the future of southern Italy. By Christmas of 1052, the Pope was in Worms at Emperor Henry III's side, firmly presenting the case for military action against the Normans. His arguments seem to have been persuasive. According to Herman of Reichenau, not only did Henry cede control of Benevento and other key territories in southern Italy to the papacy, but he also agreed to provide military support. Herman writes, "After the Pope had made many complaints about the acts of violence and injuries perpetrated by the Normans, who held the property of St. Peter by force against his will, the Emperor assigned a military force to help him to expel them from there." The Chronicle of Monte Cassino supports this account, but adds that Henry's advisor, Bishop Geffard of Eichstätt, strongly opposed the decision and cleverly managed to have the entire army recalled. The papacy's recruitment effort for an army in 1053 largely depended on the efforts of the papal chancellor, Frederick of Lorraine, who successfully enlisted contingents from beyond the Alps. The number of recruits varies across sources. Herman of Reichenau states that many Germans joined the Pope, while Amatus estimates just 300. The Chronicle of Monte Cassino mentions 500, and William of Apulia later adjusts his initial claim of innumerable Swabians and Germans to 700 Swabians, led by Werner and Albert. Regardless of the exact number, the Pope returned to Rome in early spring with a solid force, including several hundred Swabian warriors known for their deadly swordsmanship. As Leo advanced south, he assembled additional forces from the Lombard and Italian states of central and southern Italy. Troops came from regions as far-flung as Fermo and Ancona on the Adriatic, Spoleto, the Roman countryside, the Principality of Capua, and Benevento itself. Notable Lombard leaders included Duke Adolf of Gaeta, Count Lando of Aquino, Count Landulf of Tieno, Raufred of Guardia, Raufred of Luzenza, Malfredus of Campomarino, the brothers Trasmund and Atto, counts of Chieti, and the influential Borel family of the Sangro Valley in the Abruzzi. Although these contingents were numerous, they fought under separate banners and ultimately lacked unity and effective coordination. Popular modern accounts of the battle, such as that of Filippo Don Vito in Medieval Warfare, estimate the total number of papal troops at around 6,000. However, this figure is purely speculative, as no contemporary source provides an exact number. Amatus merely notes that the Pope and his knights had hopes of winning the battle because of their great numbers, while William of Apulia describes the papal army as a large force of Italians, supported by innumerable Swabians and Germans. It is generally assumed that the papal forces outnumbered the Normans, based on William's statement that the Normans were seen as inferior in number and strength. The papal forces held a key advantage. They could rely on the neutrality of Salerno, as the newly installed Prince Gisulf had cautiously decided to stay out of the conflict. His stated reason was his ongoing struggle with Amalfi, but there was also a clear element of anti-Norman opportunism in his decision. Regardless of his motives, Salernitan neutrality, something Guaimar had refused to embrace, protected the papal army's flank and allowed it to move into Apulia without significant resistance. The Pope, having led armies before, planned to join forces with a promised Byzantine contingent near Saponto. Meanwhile, the Normans could not have been unaware of the papal intentions. The Pope's efforts to recruit allies from the Italo-Lombards would have likely alerted them to his plans. Furthermore, they were probably aware that the Byzantines intended to ally with the Pope against them. Humphrey, having assumed Drogo's role as Count of Apulia, would have kept a close watch on the Byzantine catapan, particularly after the latter's attempt to bribe them at the request of the Eastern Emperor. To face this imminent threat, the Normans gathered nearly every knight capable of riding into battle. Guiscard, fresh from his victory at Croton, led his men from their strongholds in Calabria. Humphrey, commanding the vanguard of knights from Apulia, was joined even by his rivals. Such was the gravity of the situation. Among them were Pierre and Gauthier, the sons of Ami, and Richard of Aversa, who recognized that the fate of the Norman presence in southern Italy would be decided in the upcoming confrontation. Richard swiftly placed his knights under Humphrey's overall command. Humphrey was not without seasoned warriors in his ranks. Many, like the Amicus brothers, Walter and Peter, had fought alongside him since the early 1040s, when the Normans first seized Melfi and established their base in the Basilicata. Among them was Hugh Tudebove, a fierce and renowned warrior. Before the Battle of Olivento on the 17th of March 1041, he had struck the horse of a Byzantine emissary with his bare fist, knocking it senseless to the ground with a single mighty blow, a testament to the raw power and tenacity of the Norman fighters. The Normans were a battle-hardened group, unaccustomed to surrender or defeat. Many had known each other for years and fought in tightly coordinated cavalry units under the leadership of their respective lords. William of Apulia estimates that the three Norman companies totaled 3,000 horsemen and a few infantry. However, Robert Buneman argues that this figure might be too high, suggesting that even William the Conqueror likely had no more than 2,000 cavalry at Hastings. Despite the uncertainty surrounding their exact numbers, chroniclers suggest that the Normans were significantly outnumbered by the forces arrayed against them. The Chronicon Volturnense suggests that the papal army took a roundabout route from Benevento to Apulia. According to the early 12th century chronicle of San Vincenzo al Volturno, they traveled through the Baferno Valley, camping at a place called Sale, which Michele Fuiano speculates was near present-day Guardialfiera. This route likely led them northward from Benevento, avoiding Norman-controlled territory. The more direct path passed through the Monte della Daunia, dominated by the Norman fortress of Bovino, but the papal army chose the longer route to bypass such strongholds. From Sale, the army likely crossed the Biferno River and continued east along the Via Traiana Frentana, passing through Larino before crossing the river Fortore at Ponte di Civitate. The Norman leaders opted for swift action in order to confront the opposing army before it could unite with the Byzantine forces. This strategy proved successful, as it effectively neutralized the Greek army, which was maneuvered into a passive position. Some sources even suggest that this was the result of treachery, with the Byzantine forces ultimately playing no significant role in the ensuing battle. Most of the Normans likely arrived well before 17th of June 1053, traveling across the Tavoliere delle Puglie, a vast alluvial plain stretching from the Monte della Daunia to the Gargano promontory. Richard of Aversa and his knights likely came via Bovino, while Guiscard's forces probably moved through Ascoli Satriano. Those from Melfi and Venosa in the Basilicata likely took a route further east. Michele Fuiano suggests that the Candelaro River, near modern-day San Paolo di Civitate, could have been another path. Assuming Humphrey had recently defeated Argyros at Saponto, he would have led his forces, along with the Amicus brothers, along this route. The two armies camped on opposite sides of the Coppa Mengoni, with a small hill between them, preventing direct sight of each other, as noted by William of Apulia and the Anonymous of Benevento. The Norman army that confronted the papal forces near Civitate was far from ideal condition. Exhausted from weeks of forced marches under the summer sun, they also suffered from hunger, as local inhabitants hid supplies or refused to aid them. Chroniclers report that, on the eve of battle, the troops resorted to roasting raw grain over fires for sustenance. Yet despite their fatigue, they understood that defeat would mean the loss of their hard-won freedom and the wealth they had accumulated over the past decade. Victory was their only option. The day before the battle was spent in negotiations initiated by the Normans, perhaps to buy time, or perhaps to avoid a direct clash with a larger army led by the Pope himself. They offered vague promises of future loyalty and even suggested doing homage for the lands they had taken in Benevento, though they refused to return them. These proposals were swiftly dismissed by hardliners in the papal camp, and the Swabian troops openly mocked the Normans' military reputation. Feeling insulted and cornered, presented with what they saw as a stark ultimatum to surrender or be crushed, the Normans chose a third path. They prepared to fight at dawn. Before dawn on the 18th of June 1053, William of Apulia recounts that the Normans climbed the hill to inspect the enemy camp, after which they armed themselves. Richard of Aversa took command of the right wing, Humphrey held the center, and Robert Guiscard was assigned to the left, likely in reserve. Robert's Calabrians may have been concealed behind the southern slope. This aligns with common Norman tactics, using a hidden cavalry force to deliver a decisive charge. Jim Bradbury and Robert Buneman support this interpretation, and the use of concealed reserves recalls classical precedents, such as Hannibal at Cannae and Caesar at Pharsalus. Although the chroniclers do not detail the terrain, it is reasonable to assume the Normans made use of the high ground, particularly the crest of the Coppa Mengoni. Humphrey, having reconnoitered the enemy from the hill, would not have surrendered such a tactical advantage. The papal leadership must have recognized that battle was imminent as the Normans formed their lines. Although Amatus names Rainulf and Renier as commanders of the papal army, they are not corroborated by other contemporary sources. Robert Buneman suggests that Pope Leo IX may have organized the army himself in the urgency of the moment. The Swabians were positioned on the right flank, facing Humphrey's Apulians, while the Italo-Lombards held the left against Richard of Aversa's elite knights. Leo was particularly focused on motivating the Lombards, who were undisciplined, poorly armed, and drawn from various regions. Only the nobility among them were likely armored and mounted. Their lack of cohesion, diffuse leadership, and inexperience left them ill-prepared. William of Apulia harshly described them as the dregs of Italy, characterized by fear and disorder. By contrast, the Swabians under Werner and Albert responded swiftly and efficiently to commands. Richard of Aversa could not have failed to observe the vulnerability of the enemy's left flank, and he acted decisively. According to Amatus, Count Richard divided the Germans and passed into their midst, yet this claim appears highly improbable. Such a maneuver would have required Richard to cross in front of Humphrey's position and plunge into the center of the strongest papal contingent, the Swabians, while exposing the Norman right to an attack from the larger Italian wing. William of Apulia offers a more plausible account, asserting that Richard charged directly at the Italo-Lombards. The sight of a massed cavalry charge, hundreds of armored knights descending the hill at speed, would have been terrifying even to seasoned troops. For the ill-prepared Lombards, it proved too much. They broke almost immediately. As William recounts, fear filled them all, and they turned and fled across hill and dale. The collapse of the Italo-Lombard left flank may have been accelerated by an act of treachery. The anonymous contemporary author of the Vie et Miracles du Pape Léon IX alleges that a certain Count Madalfrid, likely Malfredus of Campomarino in the Molise, betrayed the papal cause in exchange for Norman silver. According to this account, he had secretly arranged to flee with his troops at the first charge of the Norman cavalry. If true, such a betrayal would almost certainly have triggered panic and a full-scale rout among the already unsteady Italo-Lombards. Though no other contemporary source confirms the story, it remains within the bounds of plausibility, given the context. The Swabians, unlike the disorganized Italo-Lombards, proved to be a formidable and disciplined force. Well-led and resolute, they stood their ground with determination. Unlike the Normans, who were raised from childhood as horsemen and excelled in cavalry tactics, the Swabians were unfamiliar with mounted warfare and chose instead to fight on foot, where they could make best use of their preferred weapon, the sword. Humphrey, ever the tactician, opened the assault with a volley of arrows, his archers releasing their deadly projectiles into the air, aimed at the heart of the Swabian ranks. The Germans, ever proud and steadfast, responded in kind, losing their own arrows in retaliation. But there was no time for further volleys. With a guttural roar, both sides surged forward, swords drawn, hearts filled with the heat of combat. The Germans were a fierce, proud people, unaccustomed to the saddle but masters of the battlefield on foot. They charged with the unmistakable rhythm of warriors who had long forged their strength in the heat of battle. As William of Apulia noted, these were men of great courage, but little knowledge of horsemanship. Unable to wield their lances with the same deadly precision as the Normans, they instead brought the weight of their longswords to bear, swords very long and keen, capable of splitting a man in two with a single savage stroke. The clash that followed was nothing short of a slaughter. The noise of steel meeting steel echoed across the battlefield as bodies fell, horse and man alike, in a swirling chaos of blood and death. William's embellished accounts ring true to the horror of the scene. Human bodies split down the middle, and horses rearing in their death throes. The Swabians, true to their reputation, fought with relentless fury, their swords swinging in wide arcs, carving a bloody path through the ranks of the Norman forces. The ground became slick with gore, and the air thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and blood. For a time, the battle reached a standstill. The Swabians held their ground, resolute and unyielding. They fought not just for survival, but for their honor, each strike a testament to their unbreakable will. Humphrey's men, who had anticipated an easy victory, found themselves stalled, struggling to make any headway. The Swabians were a formidable force, and it was clear that this battle would not be won easily. Taviani Crozzi speculates that at one point, Humphrey's forces may have been driven back, though no contemporary source corroborates this. However, the reality of the situation was undeniable. Humphrey's forces were on the brink of being overwhelmed. Robert, sensing the urgency, made a decisive move. He maneuvered his wing around the hill, taking a wide sweep from the south to the west, and crashed into the German right flank with the ferocity of a predator closing in on its prey. The shock of this new assault rattled the Swabians, who, despite their courage, found themselves caught in a deadly pincer. The tide of battle had turned, but the carnage was far from over. The relentless clash of steel, the cries of the fallen, and the blood-soaked ground bore witness to a conflict that would decide the fate of Italy. And as the battle raged on, it was clear that neither side would emerge unscathed from this brutal test of strength and will. William of Apulia's account of Robert Guiscard's actions during the battle is marked by exaggerated and heroic language, echoing the style of epic literature like the Chanson de Roland. He describes Robert as a fearsome warrior, able to strike down enemies with both his lance and sword, his blows striking true with terrifying precision. According to William, Robert was unhorsed 3 times during the battle, only to rise each time with renewed fury, more determined and violent than before. His rage, William suggests, was like that of a lion attacking weaker prey, growing more intense with every resistance he met. The depiction of Robert's combat skills is further dramatized by the gruesome details of his actions. He is said to have mutilated the bodies of his enemies, severing hands, feet, and heads, with a particular focus on emphasizing his strength and bravery. In one passage, William claims that Robert's cuts were so powerful that he made the heads of taller men seem no larger than those of shorter individuals, highlighting the idea that true courage is not reserved for the physically imposing, but often resides in those of smaller stature. While this account is highly embellished, it underscores Robert Guiscard's reputation as a relentless and mighty warrior, whose prowess in battle was both feared and respected. The hyperbole, though exaggerated, serves to convey the immense impact he had on the battlefield. The battle between the Normans and the Swabians had reached a bloody stalemate. The clash between the two forces had been brutal and unrelenting, each side determined not to give an inch. But the deadlock was not to last. In the midst of this chaos, Richard of Aversa, having regrouped his knights after their earlier pursuit of the Italo-Lombards, returned to the fray. The river, a natural rallying point, had served as the perfect spot for him to reform his cavalry. Once Richard had his forces gathered, he returned to the battlefield to find his comrades still locked in fierce combat with the Swabians. The sight of the beleaguered Normans, fighting tooth and nail against the sturdy Germans, spurred Richard into action. With a fierce rallying cry, Richard charged, his knights surging forward like a wave crashing against a cliff. The force of the charge was overwhelming. The Swabians, already exhausted from the prolonged fighting, were caught completely off guard. Their backs were turned, their focus on the desperate battle with the Norman center. In an instant, the weight of Richard's knights descended upon their rear. The sound of hooves pounding the earth, the clash of swords against shields, and the screams of the Swabians filled the air. The Swabians, battered and near exhaustion, could not withstand the onslaught. Having already fought valiantly with the Norman cavalry in the front and feeling the weight of the battle on their shoulders, they were now trapped. The flood of Norman cavalry from behind broke their resolve. Their ranks faltered, then shattered. The once proud Swabians who had fought so fiercely on foot now found themselves overwhelmed, their resolve crumbling in the face of relentless pressure. The Annales Beneventani reports that 300 of the Pope's knights fell, but the real devastation came from the Normans' final push. Few, if any, of the Swabians survived. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of the fallen, their long swords and shields scattered across the blood-soaked ground. The once strong German contingent was broken, their courage extinguished by the overwhelming force of Richard's cavalry. What had begun as a hard-fought battle ended in catastrophe for the Swabians, their resistance crumbling under the weight of Norman fury. Leo IX stood helpless on the walls of Civitate as his vision of imposing papal power over southern Italy crumbled. Both William of Apulia and Geoffrey Malaterra report that the Pope sought refuge in the city as the battle ended, while the Anonymous of Benevento suggests he withdrew there after the initial clash. Regardless of how he arrived, the chroniclers agree that the citizens forced him out once Norman victory seemed certain. The city had been under Norman suzerainty since 1042, when it was granted to Walter Amicus by the other Norman lords at the Partition of Melfi. Fearful of retribution, the inhabitants likely had little choice. Anonymous of Benevento, Herman of Reichenau, and Malaterra all claim that the Normans began besieging the city walls as Leo was expelled. The Beneventan biographer even attributes the Normans' retreat to divine intervention, claiming that a sudden wind shift turned the flames back on the enemy. Ultimately, Leo was left with no option but to submit to the mercy of his victorious foes. Leo IX was treated with respect during his captivity, but he was imprisoned at Benevento for nearly 9 months and forced to ratify treaties favorable to the Normans. Norman accounts suggest he was more of an honored guest than a prisoner, with Amatus reporting that he was continually supplied with wine, bread, and other necessities, and protected by his captors until his release. According to John Julius Norwich, Leo initially resisted agreeing to the Normans' terms, hoping for imperial support from Germany. However, Norwich believes Leo eventually acknowledged Norman rule in southern Italy to secure his release. Meanwhile, Argyros and the Byzantine army were forced to disband and return to Greece via Bari, as they were too weak to challenge the Normans following the defeat of the papal forces. Argyros may even have been exiled by Emperor Constantine. The Battle of Civitate marked a turning point for the Normans in Italy, showcasing their ability to unite despite internal differences and solidifying their legitimacy. It was Robert Guiscard's first major victory, paving the way for his rise as the leader of the Normans in the south. The battle's political implications were similar to those of the Battle of Hastings, reshaping the power dynamics in Latin Christendom and influencing the broader European political landscape.